There are moments in life when something so sudden, so quiet, and so seemingly simple happens that you don't even realize everything has changed until it's too late. For Charles, a quiet man living in California, it began when he opened the backyard door for his new kitten to explore the warm sunlight and tall grass. He had adopted her just weeks earlier, a tiny brown tabby named Brandy, full of curiosity and innocent wonder. But that afternoon, without a sound, she disappeared. Charles searched desperately. He plastered missing posters across neighborhoods, walked into shelters with trembling hope, and called her name long into the evenings. But after days turned to weeks, and weeks faded into months, that hope dimmed. Brandy was gone, and he was left only with guilt, questions, and the hollow ache of a promise broken. He had vowed to care for her for life, but her life had slipped through his fingers before it had barely begun. Thousands of miles away, in a small town in France, a family was facing their own heartbreak. In 2010, in the quiet community of Pertuis, a cat named Noel vanished from the home that had loved him for years. His disappearance struck deeply, particularly for the father of the family, who made it his personal mission to search for the feline he called his heart son. Every day he rode his bicycle through the streets of the town, calling Noel's name aloud, not out of habit, but because he truly believed one day his voice would be heard. Unlike Charles, who eventually left his old neighborhood and tried to move forward, Noel's family never gave up. They remained in Pertuis, bound to the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, their lost companion might someday return. It was hope without proof, but it was love without condition. In both stories, across two continents, years passed in silence. New pets came and went. Life carried on. But something, a certain chair, a sound at the door, an old photo, always brought back the memory of the ones who went missing. And as the world forgot, these two families quietly held on to what they had lost, without knowing how close they were to finding it again. 15 years. That's more than 5,000 days. Long enough for a child to become an adult. Long enough for memories to fade. Long enough to believe that something, or someone, is truly gone. But time, as life often proves, can also be a bridge. One that quietly stretches across years, connecting heartbreak to healing in the most unexpected of moments. Charles had moved on, or at least he thought he had. Living in the San Fernando Valley, surrounded by new cats, new routines, and a different life, he never imagined the past would come calling, and yet one day it did. Not as a whisper, but as a phone call from an animal shelter 40 miles away in Palmdale. A cat had been brought in. She was malnourished, tired, and clearly aged, but she had a microchip, and that microchip still carried his name. At first, Charles was certain it was a mistake, a clerical error, or an unlikely coincidence. How could it possibly be Brandy, the kitten who vanished when George W. Bush was still president? But something deeper, something older than logic, pulled him toward that shelter. And when he arrived, when he saw her, that worn but unmistakable face, the weight of 15 years crashed down around him. He picked her up, and she began to purr, as if not a single day had passed. Charles, a man who had long buried this loss, broke down in tears. He hadn't just found his cat, he had found a piece of himself that had been missing for half a lifetime. But far across the ocean, in the quiet streets of Pertuis, another miracle was unfolding. On January 18th, 2025, volunteers at a local animal welfare association received a call about a stray cat spotted near the neighborhood. He was old, frail, and alone. But when they scanned him for a chip, something extraordinary happened. The name, Noel, appeared. It was the same cat who had vanished in 2010. The problem? The phone number on file was no longer active. But these were not people who gave up easily. Launching a local social media campaign, they began searching for the family behind the name. And miraculously, they found them. When the former owner arrived and learned that Noel had been found just 100 meters from his original home, disbelief gave way to overwhelming emotion. The man who had cycled through the streets for years calling Noel's name now held that same cat in his trembling arms. What are the odds that a cat could survive so long, stay so near, and find his way home again? And yet, they did. These were not simple reunions. They were moments suspended outside of time, reunions born from persistence, pain, and love that never gave up. Reunions are not always happy endings. Sometimes they are quiet reckonings, moments where joy and grief walk hand in hand. For Charles and Noel's family, the moment of reconnection was not just a miracle, but also a reminder of all that had been lost during the long years apart. Brandy, once a playful tabby kitten full of energy and mischief, now moved slowly. Her body bore the wear of time spent surviving. Wherever she had been, it hadn't been easy. She was thin, her coat dulled, and her once lively spirit was quieter now, as though the world had taught her to be cautious. But when she purred in Charles's arms, that sound, soft and familiar, broke through the years of silence like a melody he thought he'd never hear again. And yet, despite their reunion, Charles was faced with a painful decision. His new apartment did not allow another pet. He had since adopted 2 younger cats, and he knew Brandy deserved peace and stability in her final years. So, with a heavy heart, he chose to place her in the care of someone he trusted deeply, his sister, who welcomed Brandy into her home with open arms. The cat, who had gone missing in youth, would now spend her last days in comfort, surrounded by love and familiarity, even if it wasn't exactly the home she had once known. But for Noel, the ending came even faster, and with far greater heartbreak. He had returned only to say goodbye. After 15 years of absence, after a lifetime of wondering and hoping, Noel was finally in his owner's embrace again. But his body, aged and frail, had carried him as far as it could. As he lay in the arms of the man who had never stopped calling his name, he began to convulse. In panic and pain, they rushed him to the veterinarian, clinging to the fragile hope that perhaps a few more days could be granted. But time, cruel in its honesty, gave no such gift. The vet's words were gentle but final. Noel's condition had deteriorated beyond recovery. His organs were failing, his suffering increasing by the hour. And so, the man who had waited 15 years for his return now had to make the impossible choice, to let him go. There, in that quiet clinic, with tears streaming down his face, he held Noel one last time. And as the world faded for the cat who had once roamed the rooftops of Pertuis, he left not in fear or loneliness, but in the arms of the only person who had never stopped loving him. It wasn't the ending anyone had hoped for, but perhaps it was the ending Noel needed. In the days that followed those reunions, everything felt different. Not just for Charles and Noel's family, but for anyone who heard their stories. These were not just tales of cats coming home. They were about the invisible threads that bind us, even through time, silence, and loss. For Charles, Brandy's return awakened something long buried. He began to see his quiet apartment with new eyes. Every soft blanket, every warm sunbeam on the floor, every gentle purr. They reminded him of promises made and how time had not erased their meaning. Though she now lived with his sister, he visited often, watching the elderly tabby stretch out peacefully, her tail flicking softly in contentment. She was no longer the kitten who disappeared that summer day, but she was still Brandy, still his. He spoke of her differently now, not as the pet who vanished, but as the companion who somehow found her way back. She had survived, endured, and returned not as a miracle, but as proof that love can reach across years and still be recognized. Her slow steps, her soft gaze, the way she curled up in a familiar lap, it was as if time had paused just long enough to let her say, "I didn't forget you." But Noel's return, that was something else entirely. For his family in Pertuis, the days after his passing were soaked in a kind of sorrow that words could never quite contain. They had waited so long, believed so deeply, only to say goodbye just as hope had finally been fulfilled. Yet, even in that grief, there was peace. Noel hadn't died alone, under a bush or in the cold. He had come home, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, to the people who had never stopped loving him. And in those final moments, the man who had whispered his name into the wind for years finally got to say it one last time, not in desperation, but in farewell. It was a reunion steeped in heartbreak, but also in something far greater: closure. Their community responded with awe. Friends, neighbors, even strangers who followed the story online wept at the tale of a cat who wandered for 15 years only to die in the arms of the one he loved. Volunteers who had worked for years without thanks were suddenly reminded why they did what they did, and people who had lost their own pets found a strange kind of comfort in this bittersweet ending. Because even though it hurt, it proved that sometimes even the longest roads can still lead home. These weren't just stories about animals. They were about promises, about endurance, about the quiet, patient waiting of hearts that refused to forget. When Brandy purred in Charles's arms after 15 years, and when Noel let out his final breath in the embrace of the man who never stopped searching, something larger than a reunion happened. These were not coincidences. These were quiet reminders that love, once given, never truly fades. It lingers in silence. It endures through absence. And sometimes, when we least expect it, it finds its way back. Not every lost pet returns. Not every goodbye has a second chapter. But these stories, Brandy's return from the shadows and Noel's final journey home, show us that sometimes hope isn't wasted. Sometimes the ones we lose are still trying to find their way back in ways we can't see or understand. Brandy's survival remains a mystery, but one threaded with kindness. Somewhere, someone must have taken her in, fed her, cared for her long enough for her to make her way back. Her return wasn't just a fluke. It was a chain of unseen kindnesses that kept her alive long enough for fate to reconnect what was once broken. And when she finally rested in her new home, she did so not as a stray, but as a survivor, a symbol of resilience. Noel's ending was different, but no less profound. He returned not to live, but to be remembered, to give his family the closure they had long stopped asking for out loud, but still yearned for in their hearts. His body may have been failing, but his instincts were sharp. He came back to the place he had known. He waited, not at the doorstep, but just close enough to be found, just close enough for love to reach him before it was too late. And in these final acts, one filled with quiet contentment, the other with a tearful farewell, we are reminded that animals feel what we feel. They remember what we remember. And their stories, even if silent for years, never truly end until we are ready to hear them again. So let these stories not be forgotten. Let them live on as proof that time does not erase love, that even when all hope seems lost, the invisible thread connecting hearts can stretch across years, across towns, across entire lives, and still hold. And if you've ever loved an animal, if you've ever waited for the sound of paws at your door, or whispered a name into the night hoping it might still matter, then you already understand. Brandy came home. Noel said goodbye.